Good afternoon and welcome to the 2016 Dairy Outlook webinar. I'm Tom Cosgrove, Senior Vice President for Public Affairs and Knowledge Exchange here at Farm Credit East, and we appreciate your joining us today. Certainly 2015 was an eventful year for the dairy industry in the Northeast. Prices were significantly lower coming off the highs of 2014. And in addition, there were times during the year when supplies exceeded the processing capacity, so milk marketing was a challenge at times as well. And while milk prices are a critical piece of the puzzle, producers also need to think about more than just what's going to be in their milk check as they look forward to 2016. So today's webinar is also going to feature two speakers discussing some key environmental regulations and emerging legal issues related to manure handling. So we're pleased to be joined by three Farm Credit East webinar veterans to provide some insights on these topics. To discuss the dairy market outlook, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Mark Stevenson. Mark is the Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a native of Michigan with degrees from Michigan State and his PhD from Cornell, where he spent 18 years on the faculty. He's part of the team behind the program on dairy markets and policy. And if you haven't checked it out, their website, dairymarkets.org, is a great resource for all things dairy. So welcome, Mark. Next, we have Carl Zinnick, Senior Extension Associate, part of the Pro Dairy program at Cornell. As we will hear, his focus is on nutrient management. He has his degrees from Cornell and the University of Buffalo Law School, and we'll look forward to his presentation on some key environmental issues as it relates to manure management. While some of these issues are going to be specific to CAFO permitting in New York, I think with many of these, there's implications for dairy producers throughout the Northeast. So we'll look forward to hearing from Carl on that topic. And finally, we'll hear from Leah Zimba. Leah is with the law firm of Michael Best. With 220 attorneys nationwide, Michael Best has an active agribusiness food and beverage group, which Leah co-chairs. Native of Wisconsin, Leah spent 15 years in New York. She attended Cornell and then Syracuse Law School. She's worked for the New York Farm Bureau and the law firm of Nixon Peabody, and works with a number of ag clients in New York and across the country. As she's now back in Wisconsin, where she and her husband are part of their family's dairy operation. Leah's going to discuss a specific lawsuit related to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And here again, while it's specific to a case in the Pacific Northwest, Leah's going to discuss how there are implications for all farms with manure storage and handling. So welcome, Leah. So before I turn over to Mark, here's to discuss the dairy outlook. Quick word on kind of the structure of today's session. We're going to hear Mark's presentation, which will be about 40 minutes, and after that we'll leave 10 or 15 minutes of questions specifically for Mark, wrapping up his portion by about 1. Then I'm going to turn it over to Carl and Leah for their presentations, followed by Q&A for both of them, and wrap up by about 1:45 or 2 p.m. As Heather mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, and as you have questions for the presenters, please type them in, and we will get to them for each of the speakers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Let me get my screen shown here. There. Can you see this okay now?
Perfect, Mark.
Good. I'll get started then, talk about the dairy market and situation. As you already mentioned, Tom, it's pretty clear that last year was a very different year than the year before, and I think that this year is going to look a bit more like 2015 did, but not quite the same either. So let me provide you with at least a little bit of what I think the outlook is going to be like. It wasn't too hard to remember the price volatility that we've seen the last few years, and it was prices on the all milk price that were around the $16 range that we considered to be low milk prices, and prices around $22 that we thought of as being highs. But just to remind ourselves, 2015 was a great year, or 2014 was a great year. We averaged, in fact, on the U.S. all milk price right around $25 over that entire year's period of time. So we've fallen now to that range that we would have thought of as being low milk prices. And you can see that by the tail end of this time period, just the last month or so, we've had prices that appear to be in some form of recovery. In other words, they're moving upward a little bit. But I think the one thing I want to try to probe a little bit today is whether this is actually the beginning of the recovery and the thing that we can hope for, or does it feel like we've still got a little bit of time to maybe be concerned about prices that could be this low or even lower for a period of time. Also important to remember that this all milk price is something we've talked about a little bit more, in no small part because we've had the margin protection program. And that margin protection program has begun to put into our dialogue a bit more about the margin, the difference between a milk price and a feed price. And the feed price that's calculated for this MPP, or margin protection program, is comprised of corn, soybean meal, and alfalfa hay, and is meant to support 100 pounds of milk, including dry cows, sick cows, young stock, and so forth. So when we go back in time and look at what that ration has been, you'll see that it was at its peak around 2012 when we experienced the drought in the grain belt area, and feed prices really got pushed to fairly high levels. They've been moving downward in a rate that looks much better to dairy farmers over the last year or more, and we've enjoyed better feed prices for sure. But you put those two things together, the high feed prices that we experienced in 2012 and the relatively lower milk prices, no question that the margins were lower then, but 2014 was in fact a very good year when we had the high milk prices and feed prices moving down. In fact, that year gave us the highest margin if we were to go back and calculate the margin that we would have ever experienced. That margin averaged for the year more than $13 a hundredweight. So by almost any metric, 2014 was an unusually good year. We have had a big drop. 2015 numbers aren't quite in. I'm showing them in red on the right there, and you can see that the decline is substantial. It looks like the kind of drop that would be as big as we've ever seen, maybe even slightly bigger. But it's a drop that's brought that margin back into something more like a typical margin rather than a margin that's unusually low. So it's a big drop, but more of a decline toward normalcy. You know, those big milk prices or big profitabilities are meant to be measures to stimulate milk production. It's a market that's telling us we want more of your product and we're willing to pay for it. And when that happens, dairy producers usually respond. This is showing us only the seasonal differences in average daily milk production over a period of time, but you can certainly see a trend moving upward. I think it's a little hard to tell whether this was a big response or not such a big response, though, to 2014. So I'll show milk production data in just a slightly different way. And that way is looking at a percent change in 1 month relative to the same month a year earlier. You'll notice that by the time we got into the latter part of the summer of 2014, producers were in fact responding to those price signals, and we had some pretty big increases. The increases were up around the 4%, but I think it's also important to recall that that's measured off of that same time period a year earlier in 2013, and that was a time period when we actually had some negative milk production responses relative to the low milk prices that we had seen in 2012. So the kind of response we got was a big percentage increase. Now what we've experienced through most of 2015 has been big in some parts of the country like the Northeast, where you've really challenged your processing capacity, but across the country those responses have actually been in a very normal range, somewhere between 1% and 2% increases on average. So when you're looking at the whole U.S., a pretty normal year as far as increases in milk production goes, but it depends a whole lot on where you were living as to what kind of increase we actually had seen. Now let's talk just a little bit about how we got there. How we got there, of course, were changes in the number of dairy cows that we had. 2014, that big profit year for dairy farmers, saw dairy producers hanging on to cows. The green line is showing you the increase in the national dairy herd that we saw, but 2015, a big decline in milk prices and a very normal sort of year as far as what profitability should be, and we've had stable cow numbers. We've had a little mild increase in the flush season of the year and a mild decrease since then, but really pretty flat year as far as cow numbers are concerned. The other part of that equation, of course, is milk production per cow, and last year gave us a big increase in milk production per cow. So it wasn't just that farms didn't cull as heavily. Even those animals that we might have ordinarily culled, we managed to get milk out of, and we pushed cows pretty hard. We got a big increase in milk production. This year, however, 2015, the red line is showing us almost no milk production increase over the last few months and very little in the rest of the year. So we haven't really responded very strongly this year in terms of increased milk production. When you look across the country, it's very clear that what's been happening has been two different regions of the world. The more traditional dairy regions, and by that I mean the Northeast and the upper Midwest, have shown some pretty strong increases compared to what we normally do. In Pennsylvania and New York, we have seen about 2% increase in milk production. Here in Wisconsin, we had about a 4% increase, as did Minnesota and Iowa. And when you look at states like Michigan, a big and growing milk production state, the first 3 quarters of the year have seen almost a 7% increase in milk production. This is why we've been challenging the capacity of the plants in the region to handle all the milk. But when we look toward the west, the largest milk producing state that we have, California, has actually declined in milk production by more than 3% for the year, and they're going to be down the last quarter of the year as well. Maybe they'll be pushing more toward the 3.5 to even 3 3/4% decline in milk production. And on the largest milk producing state, that represents a lot of milk that didn't get produced. So it's been very much a tale of two regions. And I'd like to just bore into that a little bit more to take a look at California as being representative of some of those western states that have been down. We certainly know about the drought in California, and it has been bad. Although you've probably heard or read some reports more recently that they've been receiving some large rainstorms on the coast and snowstorms in the mountain, getting a large snowpack up there. That's all been to the good, but we still can't declare the drought out there to be over. In fact, it's not likely that even if we get big rains the rest of the year and season that we could declare California's drought to be over. This has been what the U.S. Drought Monitor characterizes as being exceptional drought through the entire dairy region of that state. This has exceeded all of the drought conditions that we've ever had in recorded meteorology of California state. And in fact, if we try to find out when has it ever been as bad in California, you have to look at the growth rings in trees in the state, and the meteorologists are telling us, or the climatologists are telling us, that you have to go back 1,200 years to find a drought that's as bad as it's been. So I just say this to try to characterize this a little bit, is that this has actually been a very big event. We're now entering the 5th year of that drought for California, and it hasn't impacted agriculture as directly until the last couple of years. The first few years, the state of California met a lot of their reduced water availability by water restrictions for urban areas and for city dwellers. But in the last couple of years, there have been some severe restrictions on agriculture, and it is having an impact on feed and agricultural crops now. Just to give you a couple of comparisons, I looked at some comparative feed cost differences between the state of Wisconsin and California. Hay price in Wisconsin over much of 2015 has averaged about $150 a ton, whereas in California over the same period of time it was about $260. Corn price about $3.50 a bushel in Wisconsin, about $5 in California. Soybean meal $3.70 a ton in Wisconsin, and about $4.20 a ton in California. Now this has had quite an impact and these feed prices have actually been high in California for a few of the years of the drought, it's had quite an impact on productivity of their animals, as they just haven't pushed cows as hard in California. You can see this by comparing the milk production per cow for the two states, California in blue and Wisconsin in the red line. A lot of variability in milk production per cow in California. That's mostly because they have more heat impact out there, and in a very hot summer or year, milk per cow is impacted more severely. But the other thing I think you can tell by looking at these lines is that there's almost no discernible trend upward in the California line. Variability for sure, but no real trend over several years in terms of increased productivity, whereas Wisconsin has shown a more general uptrend in milk per cow. And if you look at the very last year here in 2015, Wisconsin has had several months when their productivity per cow has exceeded that of California. That's something that hasn't happened for more than 58 years. So this is kind of a big deal, the impact of the high feed prices in California for sure. There's also milk price differences. Again, just comparing Wisconsin with California, the all milk price in Wisconsin is always higher than California's price, but in much of 2015, the difference has been bigger than normal. And a big part of that milk price difference is the product mix that's made. Wisconsin is using more of its milk to make cheese product and a Class 3 milk price, whereas California is producing quite a lot more milk powders, and that impacts even their class prices in the California milk price system. So milk prices have been lower. Put those two things together, the margin's been poor in California. Now, talk a little bit about the year ahead. The kind of price opinions that we have can be measured pretty well, I think, by looking at futures markets. Futures markets are far from perfect, but they distill all the information that we have available at any point in time and try to think about what is the value of milk going to be in the future. This is looking at the January contract for January milk prices for both Class 3 and Class 4. And although we haven't settled that contract yet, we're getting closer to it, you can see that just 120 days ago, or about 4 months ago, 5 months ago, the milk price opinions between Class 3 and Class 4 varied a lot. In fact, they were about $3 different. That gap started to close. By the time you got to October, they were nearly the same. And then both of these price opinions have been eroding over that time period from October until the present. And although Class 3 has rebounded just a little bit in the last couple of weeks, it's not a big difference in price out here. And we can hardly call it a major rally that's been going on. So these price opinions have been changing. They've also been changing for the input prices, corn prices as an example. When you look back at the July time period, we were getting reports about cold and wet planting season and growing season out in the eastern part of the Corn Belt. That had a big impact on the price opinions for March delivery of corn, and those prices eroded quite a lot as the opinion on the quality of the crop began to show that it really wasn't that badly impacted. And in fact, it's declined almost $1 a bushel over that time. So our price opinions on milk prices have eroded, but so too have feed prices. So the margin may not be all that bad. We use those futures market prices in our forecast of the MPP margin. And last year, at what should have been the end of the sign-up time period, it was actually extended. But at the end of September, you'll see in the top panel what the forecast for those prices was. It's that black line up there. It was going to say that we would have a surge in the margin on through October of 2014, and then decline to a very respectable $10.50 a hundredweight. The blue line, however, is showing you the margin that we have actually had. The margin's been quite a bit worse than futures markets forecasted at that time. In fact, we've had a shallow dive into the payment pool, I guess, around the $8 range, but nothing more than $8 coverage would have given you any payments at all. And now we've seen some strengthening of that margin as it's pulled out of there. And if you look at the opinion as of just a few days ago in the bottom panel for the year ahead, it would say, in fact, we're going to be headed back down a little bit into the $8 range. But through the first quarter of the year, those margins should improve and take us up to nearly the $10 margin. Mind you, $8.50 has been the long-term average for an MPP margin, so a return to $10 margins would suggest that, in fact, we're going to have a pretty good year. But I'm going to try to take a look at this with my own eyes and not the eyes of the futures market. To do that, I want to dive into consumer confidence and take a look at what I think the demand for dairy products is likely to be. The Consumer Confidence Index is a survey that's conducted by the Confidence Board every month, and they ask a set of questions to consumers and record their responses, and they provide us with this index. It's very clear to see that the confidence level was fairly high in 2006, 7, and 8, and plunged as we went into that general recession in 2009, and increased again then over the time period to where we are right now. So our confidence levels have declined and have been increasing. So it's been feeling much better in terms of the economy in general for consumers. But the interesting thing, I think, is not this particular part, but if we pull apart the questions that are asked of consumers, let's take a look at those. Here's two sets of questions that actually make up that red line of the consumer confidence we were just looking at. Two sets of them. One is the present situation, and the other is the expectation about the future. So let's go back again to that 2006, 7, and 8 time period and look and see. When consumers were asked about how is the economy today, you can see their responses in blue were saying, it's great. My 401k has never been bigger. I'm spending money. I feel really good about the economy. But another set of questions that was being asked is, how do you feel about the economy in the future? And you can see their responses in green were that, well, I'm actually a little concerned about that. I don't think it's going to be as good as the economy is today. And what happens when consumers are concerned about the future? They start to get conservative with their expenditures. They don't go out to eat as much. They don't buy as many consumer products. And when we have a consumer-based economy like we do, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we begin to find that, in fact, our gross domestic product starts to fall, and we're plunged into recession like we saw in 2009. Now, when we get to that recession, it lasted for quite a period of time. 2009, 10, even 11, consumers' present situation, they were saying, oh my gosh, it's awful. Have you looked and seen the kind of reports that we have with bank failures and defaults on mortgages? The present situation is terrible, but I'm optimistic about the future, the green line. That begins to pull us up out of that, and in fact we get to where we are today with a fairly reasonable consumer confidence. Now, I go through all of this story because I want you to look at actually about the last 15 or 18 months. You'll notice that, again, we're beginning to have this divergent pattern showing up where consumers are saying, oh, it's good today, it's great today, in fact, but I'm concerned about the future. And what I hope is that it doesn't develop into something that actually pulls us back down and we become more concerned about our spending patterns and really cut back. You can see a little bit of the same pattern in restaurant performance. This is hard numbers. It's not just opinions. This is asking how many meals did the restaurant industry serve? Were they at the high end of the restaurant menu or the low end? And they construct this index to say any value above 100 is expansionary. The restaurant industry is performing better than it did before, or than its average. And you'll notice that we've been in this expansionary territory for quite a few years now, all good things. But the direction of that is beginning to move us back down toward that boundary, and I'm a little bit concerned that we're starting to begin to see at restaurants less enthusiasm for going out. I mention this because about a third of our dairy product is actually served through the restaurant segment, and that will impact what we have. Actually, at retail, dairy products have been a pretty good buy. Of course, you can imagine that the margins were much thinner for dairy processors and the retail segment during 2014 when milk prices were so high. They didn't all get passed along to the consumer. You can see that this BLS index of dairy products showed a slight increase in dairy prices or product prices to consumers at retail, but it wasn't as much as would have been warranted by the increase in milk prices. By the same token, this big decline we've had in milk prices in 2015 is not all reflected here either, but it has gone down. Dairy products really are actually a relatively good buy for consumers, and consumers are purchasing them in a pretty strong manner. But domestic consumption is no longer enough for us. We're such a big player now in exports that we've got to have a good export year to really feel good about our entire dairy industry. Take a look at 2009. In 2009, that recession we had was not just a U.S. recession, it was a global recession, and some of our customers backed away from purchases of dairy products. And this graph is showing you a representation of exports as a percentage of the total amount of milk and dairy products produced. And what you can see here is that we declined from about 11% exports of milk produced to something below 9%. This is about a 2% decline in export value. When that happened, that all stayed here at home and had to be consumed domestically, and that put tremendous price pressure to move milk prices down on our markets. Today, what makes me concerned is that we've had nearly a 2% decline in our exports once again. But this isn't the same domestic market that we're absorbing this product into. It's a much better market than it was in 2009 and 10. So it hasn't been as bad for us. But I'm concerned that if our domestic economy falters a little bit, that this is going to start to look much more ugly than it has. Let's take a look at our competitiveness in these world markets. The U.S. versus international prices is shown here. The red line is the U.S. price for skim milk powder or non-fat dry milk prices, and the green band is the Oceania price, blue band is the European Union price. We are competitive in these markets. We sell a high proportion of the world total of these market prices. So we are competitive, and that's a good thing. But right now, we're competitive at a pretty low level. We were competitive in 2014 at something more than $2 a pound. Today, we're competitive at something more like 75 or 80 cents a pound, and that's had a big impact on our milk price for Class 4. Whey prices, pretty similarly. We're very competitive here. We sell more than half of the world's whey product, and although we're competitive with these prices, it's competitive at something like 22, 23 cents a pound, and that's had an impact on our Class 4 milk prices, or Class 3 milk prices. Cheese prices, we've not been competitive for most of 2015. You'll see that we had prices here well above the competitive world prices, and only recently our prices for cheese have fallen, while the world price for cheese has come up a little bit, and we're just beginning to get to the point where we can be competitive again. The impact for us has been that we've had growing cheese stocks. If you look at this dashed orange line here, you can see that the amount of cheese stocks have been growing here in 2015, and this will begin to put downward pressure. In fact, has put downward pressure on cheese prices. We have exported some cheese, but mostly because we've had some subsidy support through the Cooperatives Working Together program. If you look back over 2015, almost every single week, CWT was making announcements that they had assisted with the sale of cheese or milk powders, whole milk powder primarily, and occasionally butter. So our exports have needed a little bit of boost for some of the products to be able to sell them at all, export product. Let's take a look at butter. My goodness, butter prices have been completely divergent from the world markets. That was true in late 2014 when butter prices hit more than $3 a pound, and it was true again this past year in 2015 when they were up there. World prices for butter have been declining while ours were actually increasing. That only lasted a very short period of time at those tremendously different divergent prices, because then the rest of the world starts to look at the U.S. as a place to send butter as opposed to us actually selling butter into the world markets. Now, let's take a look at what's happened for the product prices, not product prices, but the stock levels for butter. You would expect that this would look more like cheese and that we would be having big inventory increases of butter, but in fact we haven't. Those butter stocks have grown a little bit, but not much. Why? Well, look at something like Time Magazine. The medical community seems to have declared a truce on butter as a product that is bad for us, and in fact they've said we can eat butter, and we in fact like butter. And by the time this has come out, the sale of butter fat has been extraordinary this year. And not only in the product butter, but in high-fat categories of things like fluid milk. While fluid category is still in decline, sales of whole milk have actually been increasing, as have sales of cream products. So the U.S. economy, and in fact the world, seems to be crazy about eating butter, and we've consumed it even at higher prices. But I told you that, with the big divergence between U.S. and world prices, we're going to receive butter from overseas, and that started to happen in mid-December. That's really pushed downward on our prices. We had about a 90-cent per pound drop in the CME spot butter prices when that happened. That big decline out there represents something like a $3.50 drop in the Class 4 price when you look at it, and has an impact on Class 3 as well, because butter is a part of the Class 3 formulas. So we've had an impact on milk prices. Let's look at global dairy trade. This is an auction that happens every other week. Fonterra conducts it, and this is an index of the products that they sell on that auction. You can see that 2013 was the good year for Oceania, and in fact for the European Union as well. They've had price declines happening ever since 2013, right through 2014 when we had our great year. There's been a slight rebound recently, but it's not a big one yet, and I think the real question mark is the world ready to start buying more dairy product or not? The U.S. farm milk prices actually hold up better than the world prices have. Recent all milk price was about close to $18.50 a hundredweight through part of 2015 here, not too long ago. And at that time period, the European Union prices shown in the blue dots was about $13.50 a hundredweight, about $5 lower, or close to $5 lower than our domestic prices here in the U.S. And if you look at the farm gate prices in New Zealand at that time on a comparable basis, their prices were about $10.50 a hundredweight. Normally, these countries that are competing for world markets have a much closer relationship in farm gate prices, but this year our domestic economy has managed to hold our farm gate prices up much higher than world prices. We've had some other factors, however, excuse me, that have been pushing on our sales for export products. Our strong U.S. economy has meant that dollars or currency has been coming to this country from other countries, and we've had the strength of the dollar against almost all major currencies. Sounds like a good thing, but it's not a good thing for exports. It makes our exports look relatively more expensive, and it's harder for us to export. We've also had recently a bit of an increase in the U.S. interest rates as The Fed has been trying to get us up off the floor that's just about at zero, or has been at zero. And I think that that little bit of increase over the next few months is likely to give us even a stronger U.S. currency, and will make it even harder for us to export into those markets. When we take a look at what the competitors have been doing in terms of milk production, the U.S. Over the first 10 months of 2015 has been about a 1% increase in milk. As I mentioned earlier, that's about normal for us. New Zealand, because of those $10 milk prices, has actually had a decline in milk production and dropped about 1% in their milk production. So that's given a bit more headspace into world markets. But their neighbor just to the north, although a smaller milk producing country of Australia, has had very nearly a 4% increase in milk production and has offset all of the milk production that New Zealand lost. And then when we look at the European Union, their relatively strong 1.5% or so of increase in milk production has way added to the world milk supply. So we've still got a lot of dairy product on world markets relative to what's being demanded. One thing that might happen is this El Niño, this weather phenomenon of warm water in the Pacific Ocean. That gives us this milder winter that we've been experiencing in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. It's given us more of the storms that we've seen in the West, but I'm not talking about what's happening here in the U.S. El Niño impacts the other side of the Pacific Ocean too, and there it's a very negative impact of very hot and dry weather. We've heard recently headlines of major wildfires in Australia that's been going on, and pastures in New Zealand have been drying up. And as that happens, those countries are culling more dairy cows because their pastures simply can't support the level of milk production they've had. So we may get some relief from Oceania, but it's not impacting the EU in the same way. However, we hope that we get a little bit of tightness in those world milk supplies. We've had an option to culling or to producing milk, and that's been a cull cow price. Traditionally around 50 cents a pound, you know, in years up until about 2012, and that began to increase. In the last year or so, we've gotten used to having cull cow prices north of $1 a pound. It's dropped a good bit here in the last month or two. We're down around 90 cents a pound, and I think it's going to drop even further, but it's still historically a relatively high milk price. So if the margins don't feel as good, we have an opportunity to cull some cows here at home and receive some income from that. I want to talk for just a few minutes as I wrap up about price cycles. Now, the price cycles that we see have been roughly 36 months in length, but they differ a little bit from cycle to cycle. I'm defining a cycle as being the high point in the margins, the MPP margins, and when does that high point start to downturn is the beginning of a cycle. In 2001 through 2004, we had a cycle that started at about $12 margin, declined to about $6 before it increased above $12 range. That was one cycle. The next cycle was 2004 to 7, a little bit longer cycle. Again, started at $12, increased to more than $14. Didn't dip quite as low, but was more persistent, lasted longer. The bad cycle that we all remember started in 2007. And that cycle started from that high point of about $14 MPP margin and declined to a low of nearly $2 at the bottom of 2009. We didn't really declare that one over until we got out there about 3 years in time, and there we got up to about a $10 margin and fluctuated for a period of time. The 2011 through 14 margin had a slightly different pattern, big decline to almost $2 again from about a $10 start, but a much bigger increase to the kind of prices we've seen more recently in 2015 of about $15, $16 for the margin. Let's take a look at our current cycle that we're in, this 2014 to 2017 time period. We expect through 2017 anyway. Pardon me. The cycle began at about a $16 margin, and we have dropped to something like below an $8 margin for a few months, but we've seen an increase over the last few months time period. Excuse me once again. Now the real question is, as we're going into this time period, is this cycle over? Now remember, the forecast from the futures markets would suggest that it probably is over, close to it, that we would be up around that $10 margin and begin to find that the cycle was done. But that would be unusual for us to have a cycle that was a little more than 12 months in length. We just have never had one that was that short. Moreover, if you take a look at the patterns of cycles, I'm going to just backplay this so that I take it off and put it back on a couple of times. And if you take a look at what cycle does this look most like, you'd probably say the red one. Again, that's the one that gave us 2009, where we had this kind of false uptick in a margin before it really plummeted to those low levels in 2009. I'm expecting nothing like 2009. It's a very different year. Domestic markets are strong, but I think we're going to be headed back down, maybe even getting as low as a $6.50, $6 margin for a period of time before we climb out of it. So I'm a little less optimistic than the futures markets suggest. So my forecast is that the relatively strong U.S. economy is really helping us consume dairy products, and that's a good thing. Our dairy exports could become more of an issue over the next few months. Watch those inventory levels. Those are going to be one of the first keys that we have to as to where futures markets may begin to move as they start to anticipate a price that's a little different than what they're anticipating now. My deduction is that the MPP margin will be worse than the futures market forecast now suggest, at least through the first half of 2016. I really think that by the time we get to the third quarter of 2016, it's when we're going to start to feel like we're pulling out of all of this. But the first quarter of 2016 is probably going to be quite a bit worse than what we've experienced this last quarter or so of 2015. My own forecast is that Class 3 is likely to be down about 60 cents for the 2016 year comparison to 2015. Class 4 is likely to be up maybe $1, and the U.S. all milk price will probably be down about 30 cents a hundredweight. So that kind of sums up my forecast here. In general, what I'm suggesting to you is that if you look at futures markets, there may be more downside potential than upside. And with that, I would draw my comments to a close, and if we have time, I would take a few questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for your dairy outlook. I just want to remind everyone, if you'd like to text chat in questions, click on the red arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and that will expand your GoToWebinar control panel. And then if you look at the bottom of that control panel, you'll see a chat window, and that way you'll be able to enter in any questions you have.
Great, thanks, Heather. So, Mark, while we're collecting questions from the audience, may hit you with a couple here to start off with. About midway through your presentation, you had a couple of charts in there comparing kind of California feed prices and California milk prices with Wisconsin prices. How would the Northeast prices compare on those? I don't know if you can maybe go back to that slide and we could take a look and you can just sort of describe to us where the Northeast might fall in on that.
Sure, I think I can probably go back to that. Give me just a second. Okay, here were the milk prices for California and for Wisconsin. And I think when we compare to the Northeast, Wisconsin was still holding up their over-order premiums. Now, we experienced milk prices that were pretty similar, with the expectation that actually the mix of prices in the Northeast is much more like the U.S. average. Wisconsin has a much higher proportion of Class 3, and those prices were stronger as well. The Northeast had premiums that eroded more quickly because of the surplus milk that you had there and bumping up against capacity. So I think that you'd find that the Northeast milk price was still better than California's by a pretty good margin, but probably not as good as Wisconsin's was this year.
Great. What about, I think that was the next slide, you talked about feed. It was just the same question.
Sure. Well, let's see if, okay, so this was a comparison of feed costs. I'm not sure, I guess, about the feed costs because I didn't look at it recently, I guess. But in general, you usually have higher feed costs in the Northeast. Your basis for corn is certainly higher than Wisconsin's is. Same thing is true for hay and soybean meal. So while I didn't look at it, I would assume that the feed costs were also a little bit higher. So these margins for the Northeast were probably not as good as they were for the upper Midwest this year, but certainly better than California margins were.
Okay, great. So so we get a number of questions in. So one of the questions is prediction for the PPD or producer price differential for 2016. Mark, and maybe if you could just explain that for the audience real quick, kind of a federal order terminology.
Yeah, it is. Recognize in federal orders that we collect revenues from dairy plants based on the products that they produce. And then we pay back out to dairy producers on the basis of the components that they produce at a Class 3 milk price. So in other words, if you only had Class 3, you would collect those component values from the Class 3 plant and you pay them back out to producers. Your PPD would be 0 if the only thing you had was, in fact, milk used for cheese. If you have milk used for Class 1, however, you're going to have a milk price that's higher than that, and if you're going to have Class 4, you may have some contributions that were lower than Class 3 in general, Class 2 a little bit higher than those Class 3 component prices. So usually what happens is that by the time you've paid out the component values from a pool, you've still got a little bit of money left over, and we pay that out on the basis of the hundredweights of milk that you produced, and that's what we call the PPD. If you look at the uniform price in any order and subtract the Class 3 price from it, it will exactly equal your PPD. So when you look at the Northeast, the PPD, in my opinion, is probably eroded. I didn't look at that recently, and it's eroded because Class 1 sales have become a smaller proportion of Northeast sales. You've increased sales of other products, and you've decreased those things that contribute positively to the PPD. So I suspect that the PPD has been getting smaller.
Okay, great. We have 2 questions came in relative to China in terms of how the issues going on in China might affect dairy consumption there, and I think, ultimately, what's that impact going to be on U.S. milk prices?
Sure. We are not the biggest supplier of dairy products to China, but China has become our second largest destination for exports. So China is important to us in a very direct way. In an indirect way, if countries that do sell to China more dairy product than we do are not able to sell as much of their product to China, it means that they've got product that they're looking for homes for, and those compete with us directly as well. So China is an important member of the equation when we think about exports. China is the biggest buyer of dairy products in the world, and when they're not buying as much, it means that the world's just got more product to find home for. Now, the second largest buyer of dairy products is Russia, and Russia has not been buying nearly as much dairy product either. in no small part because their economy is in the shattered. They've had a horrible problem with low oil prices as they're a major oil exporter and sanctions that have been imposed on the country. So the two largest buyers of dairy products in the world are not buying as much, and we're looking for homes for things. Those are big deals to the export world. Now, China's economy is still an economy that looks pretty good relative to our own. Their GDP growth has fallen from maybe 9% to something like 6%. So it's softened, but it hasn't fallen. Our GDP growth is half of what China's is. So, you know, they're still buying product, but not as much.
Okay, good. One of our questioners had looking for a clarification on margins. I think we're talking about that in the context, you know, you've been using kind of the MPP margin. In terms of the forecast for next year, at one point talking about looking at maybe a $10 margin by the end of the first quarter, but then kind of as you rolled into your last slide and your final forecast talked about the, you know, the potential softness. So I think just looking for kind of a clarification of sort of how you see the MPP margin kind of playing out through, especially through the first quarter, first half of 2016.
Sure. I did talk about two different things. One is the margin that we can calculate based on futures market prices of milk and feed products. And I don't think that's particularly biased in any one way, but we do know that, like my own forecast, futures markets are going to be wrong. The real question is wrong in what direction and by how much. And my personal forecast is that they're going to be wrong on the high side right now, that they're predicting a better outcome than we're likely to see. So I've actually got margins down quite a bit more, especially in the first quarter of 2016, than futures markets are forecasting, maybe as much as 50 or 60 cents lower, that we could get into payments that would be, you know, in ranges where if you'd bought up to the $7 level, we might even be getting payments. So I'm expecting that that margin could erode below $7 level, and there's nothing like that in the futures market forecast right now.
Okay, good clarification. Also had a couple questions come in. You know, we've seen some news stories about the big storm that's gone through the Southwest recently, and a story about, you know, some significant cow losses. I think the number I saw was 35,000. I mean, is that enough to move the needle in terms of production in that region or prices?
Well, in that region, it really moves the needle. There's no doubt about it. You know, it's a significant number of their dairy cows. But if you look at the entire U.S., I think that many of those headlines were probably overblown. You know, just to put it in some perspective, 30,000 cows that may have been lost is about 10% of what we cull monthly. So, you know, that's a big bump out of that region, but in the U.S., it doesn't move the needle too much. It can move it a little bit. Even the large plants that are processing dairy product down there in the Southwest have not suffered much in the way of a complete difference in their output. Partly because milk has been shuffled around to move into those plants from areas where it's less needed, such as California, into the plants in the Southwest. But I think that in the long run, we're probably likely to look at this more like a footnote in 2015 rather than a whole chapter of what 2015's impacts were.
Okay, we got a couple more questions here. We'll try to hit them real quick before we get to the top of the hour and turn it over to Carl and Leah. Question here about the price basis on the feed price, and I'm going to make an assumption here that they're talking about the feed cost calculation in MPP, and basically whether or not there's basis added to that, or if it's off the board, you know, reflecting, I guess, the CBT or the CME prices.
Okay, what actually is being used for the feed prices are what is compiled by the National Ag Statistics Service. So they are surveying for prices all across the country, and they compile that as a U.S. average price. So it is, in fact, not the price that farms spend to purchase corn or hay, but it's the price received for the sale of corn in all these different states. It's a little bit of a different number, but it correlates very strongly, of course, with what is being spent. And, you know, for any given region, any given state, the basis is maybe a fair amount different. So, for example, the basis in California, as I pointed out, is quite a bit higher than the value that's being used for the U.S. corn price or hay price or soybean meal price. In some parts of the country, the basis is going to be lower. So if you really want to make a comparison to your own experience, then you need to take a look at historic price relationships. It's not the CME prices that are being used at all, but rather they're NASS prices for hay and for corn, and it's the Agricultural Marketing Service survey of prices for soybean meal in Decatur, Illinois.
Okay, good. All right, so two more questions here. This is one I was going to tee up myself. There was a question here about milk being dumped, and I see that really as being related to the challenges in milk marketing that occurred last spring, where there was really at times, there was some milk dumped, but just really in general a scramble among milk handlers and processors to really just deal with the entirety of the supply. Just wondering if you have any visibility on that as we look forward into early 2016 and the spring flush.
Good questions. I think that what we're likely to see is that there'll be enough price pressure that we're unlikely to challenge the marketplace quite as badly as we did last year. We had a big surge of milk at the spring flush last year, and I think that we're a little bit better prepared for it than we were at that time. But I think that we're still pushing against plant capacity in many parts of the country. It's just that, we don't have much slack anywhere in the Northeast or in the upper Midwest. And you see some responses to that by cooperatives that are suggesting that, we're going to put a form of soft quota on members that, we won't expect them to be producing much more milk. Because it's become way expensive to try to handle that when we can't find capacity for it and move it around. I think it's not going to be as big a story this next year, 2016 spring flush, but to the extent that we've got much of our feed in and the quality is reasonable, we're going to want to still make milk, but the milk price is not going to be good enough to make us want to push cows too hard. So I think we'll see more culling of animals and probably a decline in cow numbers.
Okay. So then a couple more. I'm going to call an audible here. Go a couple minutes over. Get a couple more questions come in. One is we're kind of talking about the MPP program. Maybe a quick comment, Mark, on participation, and if you have any insight into the regional levels of participation in the program.
Well, we know very well what happened last year in the first sign-up, and I have tried very recently, as in last week, to get numbers about additional sign-up this year and buy up to levels of protection above that catastrophic level or the $4 level. I think that what we saw happen by the anecdotal response that I've gotten from different states is that we had a lot more people moving down to the catastrophic level of coverage. In other words, just give me the default $4 coverage than we had the first year. And I'm not really sure how many more farms who hadn't signed up have gone ahead and signed up this year for some level of coverage, but I suspect a few did. I think that what I would say is that the producer response to the first year experience we had was kind of tepid. If you paid a bit of money to get some level of coverage, there was most farms that didn't get any payment at all, And a lot of folks said, well, that didn't work, so I'm going to just go with the $4 coverage. I think it's important to remember that this is only meant to be catastrophic coverage, and that our margins have fallen from the best year we've ever had to something more like an average level, long-term average level of margin. And producers have responded to that. So I guess that's kind of the best summary I can give you now until we get more information from Farm Service Agency about what the sign-up actually was for 2016.
Okay. The next one I just want to have you touch on quickly is, in terms of just sort of summarizing, your outlook. I mean, I think, do you kind of expect, in general, a better year 2016 over 2015?
No, I'm actually expecting a slightly worse year. Not way worse, but slightly worse. In fact, I've got that all milk price down about 30 cents a hundredweight, and feed prices maybe marginally down, but not down enough to make the margin really any better. So I think it's going to be a little bit worse. But essentially, if you got through 2015, you may have been living partly off of pre-bought inputs, feed and fertilizer, and you may not have quite as much for 2016. So in that sense, your cash flow may feel a little bit different this year. But in terms of actual profitability, it probably isn't going to be too much of a different year for you by the time we get done with 2016.
Okay. And you'd mentioned something in one of your previous responses, Mark, about some of the handlers that are kind of putting in some restrictions in terms of increased production. Do you see a trend towards that in terms of, almost like within a cooperative marketing system, for example, a base quota type pricing? Are we going to see more of that?
I think we'll see more of that in the short term, at least. The plant capacity is one of the things we talk about a lot, and regions will ask themselves, do we need another big plant here? Shouldn't we be trying to put another plant in? And I think that the correct answer to that is that the marketplace will do that in a heartbeat if they felt like they had a good market and sale for the products that could be produced from that new plant or the additional capacity in a region. But, if those sale opportunities look to be marginal or okay at best, nobody wants to stand up and put, $250 million into a new plant. So I think the capacity issue will take care of itself, but in the short term, in the long run, but in the short term, I think that we're probably looking at regions where we're going to have some restrictions on the amount of production we can have, and that's new to us. We've got to, feel how that hair shirt actually feels on us.
Okay. Well, that's, so last question for you here, Mark, and it kind of relates to that in terms of the limits on increasing production. A question came in, not particularly on the topic, but I would welcome a comment from you relative to the factors leading to increased production and efficiency, but especially something like labor. And curious what you're hearing from other spots in the Northeast or maybe seeing in the upper Midwest.
I think that labor is becoming, at least here in the upper Midwest, it's becoming more of an issue. It's not an outright problem yet, but we're more concerned all the time about it. Labor is becoming a little bit harder to find. And I think that part of this is that we are seeing less in the way of illegal immigration and the availability of illegal immigrants to join that labor force. And it is a concern. We need to solve this problem. But I think that, dairy has a bit of a problem regardless of how it gets solved. If we have more enforcement and we have less availability of labor, that's a problem. If we solve this issue and we have some kind of path to citizenship for the illegal immigrants that are here, I worry that maybe some of our immigrants would look to other industries as a means of employment. So, in some ways, I think we're going to have to address our employment issue and I'm happy to have Carl talk to that if that's something he's going to do.
Well, that's a perfect segue then, Mark. We appreciate your taking that one on, even though it's a little beyond the scope, but certainly, obviously, labor is a key factor in production. So we are going to switch gears now. I'm going to turn it over to Carl Zimick, who's going to give a discussion on some of the environmental issues, looking at CAFO permits in New York and some other things related to that. So again, Mark, thank you, and Carl, we're going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Can you all see my screen now?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Well, let's get going. I appreciate the opportunity to once again join with the Dairy Outlook webinar program sponsored by Farm Credit East. And I'm going to talk to you about the CAFO permit and some other developments that continue to evolve here in New York and the Northeast. Want to talk a little bit about winter spreading issues in general, and briefly about one of the other pressures we're starting to see develop in terms of harmful algal blooms. A response to general calls about winter spreading, New York has revised their winter spreading guidelines, and I was part of that group. And also separately, but related, New York has released 2 new CAFO permits for public comment, and you can see the web link for the CAFO, or excuse me, the winter guidelines below, and the link for the CAFO permit here is on my title slide. So just really quickly, some of the background. There are a lot of forces combining and evolving. We've had issues in Lake Erie, ongoing issues in Lake Champlain, of course the Chesapeake Bay, and renewed vigor in trying to get some response in the Bay. Long Island Sound is another one for the folks a little bit to the east of here. More locally, Sodus Bay here on Lake Ontario, east of Rochester, Owasco Lake here in the Finger Lakes, and Missisquoi Bay, phosphorus and algal problems up there in Vermont are just examples of some of the localized issues. There's been a lot of focus on winter manure application. There's a lot of questioning at the federal level, both in USDA, in EPA. Is this an appropriate practice? All of these pressures are pointing to access to more storage is going to be needed, and curiously, it also brings about more resistance in the local community, which we've also experienced here in several places in New York. So a lot of public interest at a lot of levels. I've been doing more talks to community groups and public officials about what's in a CAFO plan, what is a comprehensive nutrient management plan all about, why do people need manure storage, and especially why might they want to locate one remotely or off-site from where the animals are housed. So those are a variety of things that I'm seeing and calls that are being, that I'm receiving that are pointing, giving us a sense for the environmental direction of things to come. This slide here shows, this is a satellite image of Lake Erie. Many of you have heard about the algal blooms. You can just get a sense for the scale here. Massive, massive algal blooms. And you know, agriculture is broadly considered to be part of one of the contributors to this. There's a lot of fall application of monoammonium phosphate that's surface applied. And these are no-till, many, many acres of no-till out there. And so there's a lot of soluble phosphorus that's put out on the soil surface that has an opportunity to move. And that's one of many sources that are being looked at here. And one of the results for agriculture there in Ohio is new training requirements for applicators as well as restrictions for practices out there. If we look at harmful algal blooms in New York State, don't need to spend a lot of time on this map, but there are a lot of dots here that show confirmed harmful algal blooms, and the green dots with the black center are those that have been confirmed with high toxins. And you can see we've had a number of those over the last 4 years. This is a slide that was prepared by New York DEC and shared with me a few weeks ago. So we have harmful algal blooms here in New York and among other states as well. Again, nothing like the Lake Erie situation, but they are occurring. And those are, again, things that we need to pay attention to. So a couple of the key takeaways here, I think, for a farm level audience that we need to think about is very small per acre losses of nitrogen or phosphorus, particularly phosphorus in runoff, over many acres can add up and be important contributions to algal blooms in water bodies. So that's a key factor to think about. Small losses at the farm scale, well below any economic concern normally for the farmer, can add up and cause problems in these water bodies. And I think part of the farm solution to that is for a continued focus on improving nutrient uptake by crops, and that's going to help us reduce the losses that escape into air and water and have create problems elsewhere. Okay? And then the other thing we want to think about, given the community interest now in manure storage, is that I'm seeing around the state, if you're planning storage, among other things, do you have a public relations plan? If not, it might be a good idea to start thinking along that line. Okay, so let's switch over to CAFO permits. Mark had his tale of 2 regions, while I have a tale of 2 draft permits. Hopefully many of you know they were released just before Christmas a few weeks ago. It's important to understand that these are draft permits. They could change. I do not expect wholesale changes, although that's within the realm of possibilities. There could be some minor changes, tweaking of language that could occur. So we have 2 permits. One is based on the Federal Clean Water Act. That's no discharge up to 25-year, 24-hour storm from your farmstead area. And that 25-24 storm is a 4 to 5 inch rain for basically the most of New York State and quite a bit of upper New England as well. We also have a state environmental conservation law permit. I'm just seeing a note here. There's experiencing difficulties with the audio.
We can hear you just fine, Carl.
Okay, very good. I'm sorry. I'll keep going. So this state environmental conservation law permit for non-dischargers up to the 100-year 24-hour storm. And so in that context, that's about a 6 to maybe 7 inch rainfall, just to give people a sense for the scale there. A non-discharger, someone who might be eligible for the state permit, is operating and maintaining their farmstead in accordance with the NRCS practices or their equivalent. And those operators also will, if they don't already, have wet weather standard operating procedures. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides below. But the idea here for these wet weather SOPs is to help those farms make sure that between that 25 storm that the Clean Water Act requires and the 100-year storm that the ECL permit expects, that we're covering that and doing our best to avoid discharges in that circumstance. So both of these permits, again, are out and available for public comment. That means anybody can comment on them. The period expires February 7th, and certainly many producer and planner organizations are going to be commenting, and as well as environmental groups and others. Assuming everything goes forward and there are not too many huge alterations to the permit, we would expect it to take effect starting in July 1st. And from that period going forward, producers will have about a 6-month window to prepare and get shifted into the new permit, whichever direction they decide to go. A note about the Clean Water Act permit. The Federal Clean Water Act based permit It is the option that provides the best protection if there is, in fact, a discharge from that farmstead, from that concentrated area. And in this case, the Clean Water Act permit could be used as a defense if in the chance that there were a citizen suit. And I just want to make sure people understand that a defense is not a bar. It doesn't prevent a citizen suit, but it can be used to defend yourself should there be a citizen suit raised. So based on these federal rules, that Clean Water Act permit requires a submission of the Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan. In New York's case, we've carved out a component, subcomponent of the Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan, and we call that an Ag Nutrient Management Plan. And there's details in the permit about what that entails. But there'd be public notice, including that ANMP. A public hearing could be triggered. And then, of course, there are many other items in the Clean Water Act permit that look very much like what is also offered in the state environmental conservation law permit. And, of course, discussing the options, reading these permits and discussing options with your planner would be the place to start in terms of making decisions about which direction to go. One of the key things that are in both of these permits is that farms are going to need access to manure storage. And while the amount or term and the period are not stated, the permit is very expressly requires or states that no spreading can be conducted in saturated conditions, whether it's saturated wet or saturated frozen. The permits do require spreading with caution and other risky conditions, and that producers must use the revised winter wet weather guidelines that, again, Cornell, DEC, and Ag and Markets recently released here late in December. And I think the thing that producers need to ask themselves in order to meet this permit term is, could your farm avoid spreading if we have another late winter and spring like we did in 2014, where we had widespread extreme cold conditions and extremely hard ground conditions ripe for runoff when we had melt. Obviously, this spreading in unfrozen saturated conditions has a pretty clear price to the farm in terms of yield impacts going forward. A little less clear, though, is spreading on ground that had been saturated and then frozen. Spreading on that type of ground can be akin to spreading, would be about the same as spreading on this parking lot. And so this is a case where nutrients applied on hard frozen ground like this can be very prone to runoff. And that's what the permit is trying to get at. So going forward, some other key pieces in the new permits is a cap on single manure application rates, not allowed to exceed the saturation level of the soil, or a maximum of 20,000 gallons per acre in an individual application for manure. There's a requirement for annual farm-specific staff training and a meeting with the planner to talk about specifics of setbacks and so forth on that farm and the lands that they operate. And in addition, once every 5-year permit cycle, some of the key farm staff will need to attend a general manure applicator training that DEC approves. Many of you have had staff go through that. For example, the CAFO off-road show that I do, and some other planners are also offering that to their clients. Another new item here is custom applicators. There's a requirement that custom applicators sign a statement that they understand the CNMP, and that includes rates and setbacks. There's additional clarification that needs to be developed here, but when applicators show up and are undertaking manure spreading for the farm, they're going to need to sign this form. One of the good things I think that the permit brings forward is when a CAFO buys a new farm. In the past, there have been questions or issues about how do we incorporate, or do we incorporate that new operation into an existing CAFO permit and operation. The new permits allow for a process to get the new facility into compliance with some timelines stated within the permit. As I mentioned several slides ago, under the ECL permit and as well as the Clean Water Act permit, there's a wet weather plan required for the farmstead. So the idea is to provide protection up to that 100-year storm. For example, if you have a hurricane coming up the coast, what steps are the farm going to be taking is around the farmstead to limit the discharge potential? So for example, uncovered barnyards maybe need to be cleaned up, equipment wash areas, empty the low flow pit for the bunker, make sure you got enough freeboard in your storage, and those types of things. That would be worked out for the individual farms between the producer and the planner. A couple other things, there's notice required for both the ECL and the Clean Water Act if the farm intends to increase cattle numbers mid-permit by more than 20%, or add more than 1 million gallons of manure storage. A point that I want to make is that there have been many large CAFOs parked in the Clean Water Act permit since 2004, and those farms now will be in a position of having to make a decision about jumping over into the ECL permit for non-dischargers or the Clean Water Act permit to comply at the federal level. Both of those permits do allow 12 months to get evaluations by a professional engineer of any storages, vegetated treatment areas, or manure transfer systems that may not have been evaluated yet. So I'm going to switch over quickly here for a few moments into the area of the revised wet weather guidelines. As I mentioned, there have been actually calls to ban all winter spreading. There, Cornell, Ag and Markets, and DEC staff collaborated on revising our wet weather guidelines document. In part, this is based on a recognition that while winter conditions may be unsuitable, they are not always unsuitable for manure applications. And our goal here is to help managers to better understand what conditions are less risky and what conditions are super risky. So the revised guidelines call for farms to have a general winter spreading plan if spreading activities are intended to go on during the winter. There will be an emergency spreading plan in which case storage is full or approaching full. It's important to understand that not every year is going to be the same, and we're going to need to get into a place where we can hold manure in these really marginal conditions, and probably means thinking about sizing storage capacity or access to storage for the bad years, not the average year. So what is risky and why? Pretty obviously wet weather and snowmelt. One of the new concepts that we're talking about, I've been talking about here the last year or so, is this one of concrete frost. That is based on some relatively recent Wisconsin runoff monitoring, is one of the types of situations that are considered to be very risky. And if we think back to the late winter, early spring of 2014, I think many of us can understand that we had concrete frost conditions. Also, deep snowpack is considered risky, and anytime there's an ice layer either on the soil surface or in the snowpack, any of these things that prevent manure from contact with the soil and getting some infiltration are risky runoff types of conditions. So this runoff loss can be high unless we have soil contact or infiltration. And we also need time. The data suggests that just a few days of time of interfacing with the soil and infiltration we can runoff conditions actually go back to background levels as if no manure had been applied at all. So again, the worst conditions are these concrete frost, ice layer, or deep snowpack. And this next slide is intended to help illustrate what concrete frost looks like. You have soil that's saturated, it freezes hard. If you look at these bricks, the space between the bricks and the holes in the bricks would be those pore spaces that are normally part of our soil conditions, wormholes, cracks, and so forth. When those are full of water and frozen, there's no opportunity for manure to interface with that soil condition, and certainly no opportunity to infiltrate. And so there's a high risk for runoff in these types of situations. Again, if you look at a layer of ice on the surface, if you just spread manure on this and then you get a warm period, that's highly likely to move off. And of course, a little bit of a funny slide there with deep snowpack. Potential for runoff is pretty high in those cases. So not all frozen soil is a risk, and if we have these frozen granular conditions, you can see that honeycombing of the soil. If you were to spread manure in a situation like kind of experienced something like this over the last week or two, you can get some infiltration, some interaction, and as long as there's a little bit of time after that application before runoff, we should be pretty good to go. So this is a situation by what I'm talking about is not necessarily a high-risk winter application type of scenario. Of course, if we bust up the frost layer or snow cover and put the manure underground or at the surface, again, we can reduce the risk of off-site movement. And this is the type of thing we certainly would like to avoid, where we have March conditions, we have a snowpack full of water because it's been melting down, and we have fresh manure and lots of runoff, and that's a recipe for loss and potentially a visit from DEC if you get caught. So last slide here. I think the fall of 2015 was a gift in terms of manure spreading. I know many farms took advantage of the good weather, especially after mid-fall, to get manure out and get their storages down. So that's good news to me and good management, and I know there's a lot of appreciation for that. I'd like people to think back about to the spring of 2014. Did you have adequate storage to hold through that period? If not, maybe that needs to be our baseline to think about. It's really important to understand, a lot of people ask me about, well, if I got well-drained soil, do I really need to have manure storage or more storage? If you have well-drained soil, the probability of concrete frost is lower, but when that soil is frozen solid and you have those concrete frost conditions, your soil drainage makes very little difference. So well-drained soil, concrete frost is the great equalizer there in terms of drainage potential. Obviously, keep looking at the weather forecast, consider split applications or incorporation of manure if we can get it under the soil. It's a lot safer from runoff. As I mentioned, a winter spreading plan and emergency plan are going to be important parts of CAFO plan going forward. And another thing we just need to think about, how do we match our need to spread with the land's ability to accept and integrate the manure? And that's going to be a concept and will need to be a guiding principle over the next few years as we try to reduce the loss potential of our applications. Okay, thank you, and that's it for the moment.
Okay, great, Carl. Thanks so much. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold questions. A few questions have been rolling in for you, Carl. We're going to hold those to the end. I think it'll be good to have both you and Leigh on the line to be able to handle those. I am going to ask one quick clarification on your 7th slide. I think talked about the New York permit. That would take effect July 1, 2016, correct?
Yes. I'm sorry, did I have 15 there?
In one of those slides. That's from the context, we figured that. And the other thing I'm just going to ask you is if you would mute your phone. We seem to have lost you on the control panel, so while Leia's presenting, going to have you just mute your phone at your end because we can't mute it from here. And then we'll bring you back on for the Q&A with Leia. Okay?
Okay, muted now.
Okay, super. And so now I'm going to turn over to Leia Zimba. Leia, we're putting you in a little bit of the tough spot of with batting cleanup here to in terms of our time frame, but we do want to hear about the Yakima Valley case. I think some key implications here relative to manure storage and handling. So let's turn it over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone, and thanks again for inviting me to participate in this. Can everyone see my screen? Are we good to go?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. I will be efficient here just so we allow some time for questions. I know Carl will help me field those when the time comes. I'm going to cover the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act because that was the federal statute involved in the Yakima Valley decision. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of that statute, a summary of the case, and then the implications that has for dairy operators, and then just a very quick moment on some insurance policy considerations, just as a reminder. So RCRA was enacted in 1976. It amended the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and it was touted as a cradle-to-grave regulatory system for solid and hazardous waste. So the statute's focus is on the generation, transport, treatment, storage, and disposal of solid and hazardous waste. The picture there is of a landfill because landfills are regulated under RCRA and is what people generally think of when they think of that statute. The kind of key provision of RCRA, and this came into play in the Yakima Valley decision, was it prohibits causing or contributing to an imminent and substantial endangerment to human health or the environment. You might ask what imminent and substantial endangerment is. It's a good question. It's case specific. District courts, federal district courts, and circuit courts have varied interpretations of what that means. I can tell you that it's not limited to emergency situations. So imminent and substantial sounds like you have a match and you're about to set fire to something. It's not quite that. It's less than that. But what it is really a case-specific and a court-specific analysis. Now, the kind of key provision on causing or contributing imminent substantial endangerment can be enforced either by EPA or by private citizens. And in the Yakima Valley decision and case, it was a citizen suit. So this federal statute, and this is not uncommon, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act allow similar citizen suits. But RCRA, like those statutes, allows a citizen to act as a private attorney general in enforcing against violations of RCRA. Like the other citizen suits, there is a notice period as well as a defense if a state or federal government is, quote, diligently prosecuting the claim. The reason why these are very interesting provisions is that the third bullet here, a court may award reasonable attorney and expert witness fees to the prevailing party under the citizen suit provision. So a lot of plaintiff's attorneys use these citizen suit clauses to bring a suit. They allege that the state or federal agency is not adequately enforcing the statute, and then tries to seek their attorney's fees and expert fees. And again, that happened in Yakima. In order to be covered by RCRA, it has to be a solid waste. Again, we typically think of this as landfill type things. So this is a picture of what most people think of as a solid waste. This is actually what the statute defines as a solid waste. And you can see that other discarded material, including materials from agricultural operations, can be considered solid waste. There is an exemption for certain materials, and that exemption is right here on the screen. It is not a solid waste for if it's an agricultural waste, including manures and crop residues, returned to the soil as fertilizers or soil conditioners. And that's in the federal regulations. implementing the RCRA statute. This was the exact clause at issue in the Yakima Valley case. Just to jump right into that, this is a picture of, from a local newspaper in the Yakima Valley about at least one of the dairy operations at issue. When we say the Yakima Valley case, it's actually Cow Palace was the name of the entity. Cow Palace relates to 3 entities that were related through either land practices, ownership, and or management. It was about 11,000 cows total on site. The plaintiffs were both a local Washington State environmental group called Community Association for Restoration of the Environment, or CARE, and then Center for Food Safety, a DC-based organization that certainly helped with funding. The history, and I'm going to spend just a little bit of time to kind of walk through this because I think it's important, and it ties into what we just heard from Carl. The genesis of the case is that after an inquiry from a local journalist in the Washington Valley, EPA was persuaded to use its investigative authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act, so a different federal statute, to monitor groundwater quality surrounding CAFOs in the Yakima Valley. After that happened, in March 2013, EPA entered into an administrative order on consent under the Safe Drinking Water Act with Cow Palace and a few other farms to address what was found to be high nitrates in the drinking water aquifer surrounding these CAFOs. The citizen suit was filed in February of 2013, and in January of 2015 there was motions for summary judgment, and the key issue was the defendant, the farm, was arguing that manure is not solid waste under RCRA. So they filed a motion for summary judgment. That's a motion that's done after some discovery, but before trial, to try to resolve legal issues early. And so the effort was to try and say if manure is, to determine that manure is not a solid waste under RCRA, therefore there would be no jurisdiction for that imminent and substantial endangerment citizen suit. I know that's a lot of legal jargon, so hopefully I'm trying to give an overview without getting too far in the weeds. The issues that the Yakima Valley court looked at was whether or not animal waste, when over-applied onto soil and leaked into groundwater, was considered solid waste, whether the dairy's manure management, storage, and application procedures really constitute open dumping under the statute, and whether or not all of those practices caused an imminent substantial endangerment. You will see that the way this is how the court frames the questions. Whether or not manure is a solid waste under RCRA, the issue is whether when it was over-applied onto soil and leaked into groundwater, and that's a key distinction because that matches the facts of this case. So at least as the court found it. So let's look at the actual little bit of the detail of the case. So the dairy manages over 100 million gallons of manure a year. They handle that several different ways, sometimes gifting it to third parties, composting it and then selling it, applying it to the fields, or storing it in 4 lagoons. And that's italicized because they had a range of storage features that may not, from the history, may not meet what we would in New York or in other states would really consider an appropriate waste storage facility. So let's just call them manure lagoons. Again, 11,000 animals and 533 acres. The court found that the farm managed its manure in a way that was inconsistent with its nutrient management plan. It's a CAFO. The state had a CAFO program. The farm had a nutrient management plan, but did not manage their manure consistent with that. I've outlined just a few of the kind of key distinctions that the court found the dairy did not do, and this is a unique situation that there are hundreds of thousands of pages of discovery and court documents that a federal district court reviewed in order to determine whether or not the dairy is meeting NMP. So if you think it's difficult to explain to a citizen what your nutrient management plan is, think of summarizing that for a judge and really providing the information that would support to a judge that you've complied with that. And so in this case, the dairy estimated their nutrient content of manure instead of actually calculating it. They only looked at nutrient content from one lagoon and assumed it was uniform over all of their 4 lagoons. Did not consider residual nutrients in soil when calculating necessary nutrient applications, so they used a very general assumption on nutrients in the soil instead of doing appropriate soil testing. Documented that they applied more nitrogen than the crops could use, and the court found millions of gallons more nitrogen than the crops could actually uptake, and they had a number of experts opining on all of these issues. And the farm also applied manure to bare ground where no crops were planted. Now the exemption that I walked through with you in the beginning of this slide, or beginning of this presentation, the exemption under RCRA. So agricultural waste is not a solid waste if it's returned to the soil as fertilizers or soil conditioners. In this case, the court found that the application of the manure was, in their words, untethered to the nutrient management plan and made without regard to the fertilization needs of their crops, that made the manure a discarded solid waste under RCRA. So it got very specific and looked at whether or not the manure application actually matched the crop needs. And one of the last things that Carl said in his presentation is the need for operators to match both the need to spread on the land's ability, or the need to spread on the land versus the land's ability to accept and integrate those nutrients. And this is a very real reason as to why that is going to become increasingly critical. Some of the other interesting things that came out of that case is that a judge looked at NRCS standards for constructing manure lagoons. They noted that there's a designed leakage rate from certain earthen lagoons, so that made it appear as they were temporary storage before manure is actually land spread. And the court has this very difficult quote that says, manure leaking from defendants' lagoons is not a natural expected consequence of manure's use, but is really a consequence of poorly designed temporary storage features. Now this is where the fact-specific nature of these lagoons is important to remember, but it's certainly a judge looking at NRCS standards and evaluating whether or not that implicates whether or not manure is a solid waste under RCRA. The court also found that composting manure, one of the ways that the farm managed their manure is composting, as I said, and they found that composting manure was also left manure as a solid waste because this was on unlined soil for later use as compost, so not following NRCS guidelines for composting manure. They also found that this discard leaching constituents of manure, was the solid waste for the same reasons as the lagoons. And because of this motion for summary judgment, the decision, those are the findings I just talked about in January, the parties worked to try and reach a settlement before trial. So the summary judgment decision was in January. This was set to go for trial on May 11th of 2015, and on May 5th there was a notice to the court that the parties had reached a settlement agreement. Certainly I was not counsel to these parties, and so I would only be speculating as to what drove the parties to settlement, but after the decision that I just walked through from a court, I think the writing was on the wall that really the only thing that was left for a judge to determine was penalties and injunctive relief. What could the court make the farm do, which probably brought the parties to the table to come to an agreement of some sort. I'm going to outline this agreement because I think it's important to understand how the judicial section can really impact your operation. So the parties agreed to a settlement. Now, at the same time that this Cow Palace case was filed, 2 other neighboring dairies were sued by the same attorneys under very similar circumstances, and they all reached a consent at the same time. The settlement includes injunctive relief, so requiring the farms to do things, payment of attorney's fees, as well as monitoring costs going forward. I don't have time to get into the details of the consent decree. I'd be happy to talk about it with somebody if they were interested, or share the consent decrees. They're public. what is important here is that EPA is the overseer and is enforcing the consent decree. Under the consent decree, the EPA and the plaintiffs have the right to inspect any of the farms at issue with just reasonable notice. The injunctive relief on the farm, so actual improvements on the farms, was required with a specific timetable. So, first installing liners in 8 manure storage structures. 3 of those structures need to be lined by the end of 2015, and then there's a timeline out until 2018. You can see some other things that need to happen on the farm. A lot of nutrient management related tasks, so actually getting a nutrient management budget in place, some specific application rates set by the court, etc. The consent decree also provided for what was called a clean drinking water project, and this is funding either reverse osmosis systems or bottled water for a large area of homeowners and other businesses that receive their water from the aquifer, surrounding these dairies. So all of the dairies that agreed to the settlement are required to fund this clean water drinking water project until the consent decree is terminated. Again, providing either RO systems or bottled water to the impacted community until the consent decree is terminated, and it's not particularly clear when that consent decree is terminated. All of the injunctive relief, so farm-related improvements, need to happen in 5 years, but the Clean Water Drinking Project does not end until the farm meets some strict compliance with the nutrient management and then achieves post-harvest limits for nitrate and phosphorus that either reach specific limits or show a consistent downward trend for several years. So this long way of saying this might take a while for their obligation to fund the Clean Water Drinking Project some time. Attorney's fees, I mentioned that's the kind of the carrot for plaintiffs' attorneys. Each farm had to pay $300,000 in attorney's fees, which also covered experts and costs. So the plaintiffs' attorneys received well over $1 million, $300,000 from each of those 3. And that's just the initial award. They are petitioning the court for additional attorney's fees. So I would expect at least that much per farm to be petitioned and perhaps awarded. And then the farms also have to pay the cost for ongoing monitoring to confirm that they're complying with the settlement agreement. So this is, these are significant penalties and oversight by both the agencies, EPA, and the plaintiffs have the right to oversee. They'll be getting all the test results, nutrient management plan updates, etc. The implications of this decision, I think I kind of talked about it as we went, but for the first time, a dairy was required to conduct environmental cleanup as a responsible party under the federal RCRA statute, and their cost of cleaning up might be significantly more than what they contributed to the contamination, if you will. They're looking at a contaminated aquifer and trying to determine how much of that was impacted by the dairies. That's a very technical analysis. It's not particularly clear whether or not these farms, certainly probably didn't cause that entire exceedance. They just were the ones that were the low-hanging fruit for the plaintiffs. It calls into question, NRCS standards in certain circumstances, and really reminds producers that citizen suit and EPA enforcement actions are a real risk. And in this case, again, this started from a citizens group petitioning EPA for investigation in an area where they were concerned about a farm's contribution to groundwater quality. That's certainly influencing EPA and citizen groups across the country, including a petition filed in Wisconsin in 2014 that asked for a similar involvement of EPA in Kewaunee County, which has a higher concentration of CAFOs than other areas of Wisconsin, and asked for very similar relief as to what was granted by the court in Yakima. So it's a very real risk that plaintiffs will be looking at this as kind of an ability to copy it in at-risk areas throughout the country. I am going to cover this insurance matter just very quickly to save time. And this is it's really just meant as a reminder that I just talked about the significant costs both in farm improvements as well as in attorney's fees. I have no idea what the defendants actually paid their attorneys for defending it, but certainly expensive. So all of those costs are significant. It reminds us that it's important to confirm that a farm would have insurance coverage if something like that was to happen to them. And there was a very recent Wisconsin Supreme Court case that looked at whether or not manure was a pollutant under the terms of an insurance policy. It's a matter of state law, so the Wisconsin court concluded that manure was a pollutant when it entered a well, but every state would have their own body of case law, if you will. And in fact, the Wisconsin decision cited to a New York case. So, and these will be in the slides. Again, I could always answer questions if somebody had a specific question about this, but just for the sake of time, in the Wisconsin case, there was a general farm owner liability policy. There was an exclusion for pollutants, and any pollutant, even one recycled, could be considered a waste. The farm considered that manure was a pollutant when it entered the injured party's wells. This was a farm that applied manure. A neighbor property owner alleged well contamination based on the manure. The court decision again cited to prior cases in New York, Iowa, and Minnesota that came to a similar conclusion. And this quote, I don't expect you to read it all, but this is the Wisconsin Supreme Court citing to a New York State decision that held a very similar conclusion as the Wisconsin Supreme Court decided just this year, and that is that when manure enters a well, it is considered a pollutant, and then your general farm liability policy, if there's a pollutant exclusion, would not cover any manure-related contaminants of groundwater or drinking water. And so the kind of take-home message, the very important thing is to make sure you're comfortable with the terms of your insurance policy, review it to see what the pollution exclusion clause is and how manure be treated. Because the New York decision was 1997, I believe a lot of policies have been, revised in New York at least to consider that, but it's never a bad idea to read your policy, drag it, pull it out, and make sure you're getting the coverage that you think you're having, and having a very real conversation with your agent to talk through reasonable risks and whether or not your policy would cover that. The kind of trend, and again it ties in with where Carl ended, and that is that manure can still be viewed as a beneficial product. There's no change to that, but courts and agencies are actually looking at whether or not, based on its location and actual use, whether or not it's beneficial versus just always theoretical. Compliance with the nutrient management plan and documented compliance with the nutrient management plan is more important than ever. And there's always an element of risk management in considering how you manage manure, apply it, and of course thinking about how you can protect yourself with insurance products and those sorts of things. So I know I just talked a mile a minute. I apologize for that, but wanted to give everyone on the call enough time to ask Carl or I or Mark any questions that the last presentations maybe came up with.
Great, thank you, Leah. And yeah, appreciate your condensing that, as the slides and the presentation will be available afterwards. I'm going to ask Carl to unmute so he can join us. We did get a number of questions come in. Carl, are you with us?
Yes.
Great. So let me jump right in then to the questions. We had a couple of questions that came in on the point you made about a public relations plan related to manure storage and expansion in terms of what would a PR plan for that look like?
So we've actually put together a guidance document. There's a dairy issues team that consists of the Animal Ag Coalition, NEDPA, and I've been sitting as an advisor to that, as well as New York Farm Bureau members around that, and ADADC. So there is a document available. I have to say I'm not 100% sure where it's posted, but the things that you would have in a PR plan are basically a decision about, do you reach out to neighbors who might be locally impacted? Are there local laws that require a building permit? There are many towns where that's not the case, but there are a few that do. Should you talk to the town supervisor? I know in a number of the cases that have emerged the last year or so, some of the town officials would have are saying that they would have been in a little better position to address concerns if they'd had some information going in advance. So basically this effort to reach out to folks, having a well thought out plan, thinking about where you site, not only in terms of convenience for access for trucks in and out, but also how that might influence the neighborhood footprint are things that all need to be part of factors that need to be included in that. So I realize that reaching out to neighbors can open a can of worms, and each farm is going to have to evaluate whether that's the right thing to do in their circumstance or not.
And Carl, the document you referenced, if you found that and sent it to us, we could post that with the webinar. Would you be able to send us that?
I think we can do that. Yes.
Great. And to both Leah and Carl, so we've got a bunch of good questions in. We're almost at the top of the hour. Is it all right if the two of you can stay on with us for 5 or 10 minutes past the hour to finish the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Here.
Same here.
Carl, is that okay with you? Great. Appreciate that. Okay. Well, let's get back to them then. So is compost, Carl, I think this one's for you. Is compost, well, or actually maybe both of you, compost considered the same as manure as it relates to spreading regulations?
So certainly in terms of CAFO and winter spreading and being able to store, if that's the angle the question's coming at, yes, this is not the no spreading on saturated, wet or frozen conditions applies to a bedded pack from the heifer barn or the dry cow barn, as well as to liquid storage out of the pits.
Okay. And a question came in: if all the winter spreading guidelines are followed and documented, but you still have a subsequent discharge, what happens in that case?
So, great question. What has happened in my observation with DEC is if there's a discharge that has been discovered from field activities, one of the first things DEC is going to do is to say what was in your plan and did you follow the permit and the guidance that you were required to follow. If the answer to that is I was following my plan and I also followed the guidelines, the conversation tends to go differently than, well, I really wasn't following my plan or I didn't follow the guidelines. So basically the penalties or the repercussions are going to be greater in cases where a farm is not following their CNMP or the required guidelines in the situation of a discharge.
Okay. Let me mix it up here a little bit. Leah, one for you regarding the facts of the Yakima Valley case. Had the farm, and if you're aware of this, had the farm regularly inspected by permitting authorities prior to that local journalist's investigation in contacting the EPA?
That's a good question. There was a lot of testimony from, the person, the county specialist, I believe, that worked with their nutrient management plans. I can't speak to inspection amounts. I will say that the journalist EPA involvement was first on groundwater quality, right? So they were looking at high nitrates in the drinking water aquifers surrounding the dairies. And so, the drinking water quality was the kind of the initial trigger. I believe, and I couldn't tell you for sure if they had regular inspections, but there certainly was testimony that led me to believe that the person that helped with the farm's nutrient management plan assumed the farm was doing certain things, and the farm made the assumption and that they didn't have to do those things. And there was clear in the testimony that there was not a great understanding of what was actually required as part of the nutrient management plan. So, safe to say there were compliance issues and the nutrient management planner did not fully understand. I don't think that entity really fully understood what was happening at the farm, and then was not in a good position to defend them when they had to testify.
Carl, one for you here. You mentioned that custom applicators are going to have to sign off on the CAFO plan. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so it's not signing off on the CAFO plan in the way that a planner would or a farmer would, but basically the custom applicators are going to, the CAFO who engages a custom applicator is going to have a form on record signed by the custom applicator where the custom applicator says, I understand the CNMP and that it's important to follow it. So that means in effect, I've been given the rates, I know where the setbacks are, and I understand that I need to follow those.
Okay. And Carl, this is kind of a technical one, but a question came in about if there's a loss of potash in stored liquid manure over time.
Is there a loss of potash or potassium in the liquid stored manure over time? Is that what the question?
Maybe they meant potassium. But yeah. Or
there.
So verbatim. I'm not exactly sure what they meant by that.
Okay. There would be no loss of potassium from the liquid storage like you could have ammonia going off the surface. I don't know about how there would be some settling potentially of fiber-bound potassium to some extent, but most of the potassium is excreted in urine, and it should, I would imagine, it would stay in suspension, and there's no reason to believe there would be any loss or breakdown of the potash during liquid storage.
Okay. And Leah, back to you with one. You brought up the issue about the insurance coverage, especially being in question if with manure in certain cases being considered a pollutant. And wondered if you've seen the insurance industry addressing this in terms of policies for ag producers, to address this as a potential risk. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, they have been. So, for the first 5 years of my practice, I was in New York and worked with clients that, were going through their New York policy and their agent, and we were seeing changes amongst providers to get the right definition of manure and making it clear, when the coverage would apply. And so, that was an example in New York of kind of a change to meet the industry needs. And some underwriters are faster to react than others. In Wisconsin, because the Wisconsin Supreme Court case was this past year in 2015, and really changed some precedents, I've absolutely seen underwriters react to that. And I have to say, I have a number of clients that change has really impacted them financially. And so it's a very real risk when when I started working with a client. They had an insurance policy that provided coverage, and by the end of working with them, they don't. And so it's a very real issue, and there's a lot of different ways to deal with it. Sometimes the policy itself changes. Sometimes you can get environmental pollution as a separate standalone policy that provides additional protection. Now, those can be costly policies, and again, the devil's in the details. They could be costly and providing you the coverage that you expect, or they might be costly and not really doing what you think they do. And so being able to get comfortable with the terms, reading all of the riders that get sent to you that change the policy definitions are critical. Policy might look good, and then you might get a rider 6 months later that changes the definition, and then you have to kind of go back to the initial policy, see how the definition impacts it, and go from there. So insurance industry is certainly reacting, but there are better policies than others.
Okay, understood. So So last question here, and I'll let you include any concluding thoughts. I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn, but I think it's still relevant in terms of the proposed, the EPA's proposed waters of the U.S. regulation in terms of expanding the definition of which waters might come under the Clean Water Act. I guess I'd ask you to comment on that, possibly, maybe in connection to this subject, if there are any implications. Carl, I want to start with you.
Thanks, Tom.
Sorry, Carl.
So
you have 1 minute to answer that one. No, I'm kidding. No,
oh,
just
okay.
any thoughts you've got, given some initial thoughts on it.
If I stutter for a whole minute, I can get by here. So it's not 100% clear to me. I know there's been a lot of look and attempting to try to figure out what EPA is all about on this one. It's not clear to me where EPA is really going. I do know that New York has a pretty expansive definition of waters of the state. These can include some pretty minor streams and even some that don't even exist today because of changes in the landscape. So it's unclear to me. I've been going on the basis that I need more information from EPA or some better interpretation of what they're coming out, what they're actually going to be looking at to make a good call about how that might impact us in New York here. So I think it's reasonable to raise the alarm. We certainly don't want it to go the way of regulating puddles. I don't quite read it that strictly, but we certainly want to avoid that kind of scenario.
Okay.
The only thing, yeah, so Carl said about what I would have said, and that is that, I think the impact of the proposed rule, and of course it's in litigation now, really matters as to how your state already regulates waters of the state. And so both New York and Wisconsin, the states I have the most familiarity with, have an expansive view of that. And so, entities that already have, WPDS or Speedies permits in those states are already under a pretty strict scrutiny with respect to waters of the state, making the waters of the U.S. less of an issue. I think some of the western states it's a much more significant deal. The other thing I would say is that even if it's not likely to expand significantly the reach in states that have a broad definition, it has the potential to kind of change the burden, if you will. So it might be, and we really don't know yet how it's going to play out. And again, more information from EPA is needed. Obviously, waiting until after the litigation gets sorted out is going to be key. But what I mean by burden is that the burden might shift to the applicant or the producer in establishing that the water body at issue is not a water of the state or a water of the U.S. versus what might currently be more clearly a burden of the agency to show that it is. And so I'd say that there's a potential for that issue going forward. And just to bring it around to the legal issues, certainly in states that maybe don't have a broad definition of waters of the state and the waters of the U.S. make it more significant, it would make it, easier, if you will, for citizen suits to allege harm, imminent substantial harm to waters of the U.S. if that definition gets broadened. And so I can see it being, a potential broadening of legal risk and liability, especially in those states that have a perhaps more narrow definition of waters of the state.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. Well, thanks. Well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. As you can see on the screen right now, some previous webinars. This webinar will also be archived at farmcrediteast.com/webinars. A big thank you again to Mark, Carl, and Leah for sharing their expertise. And with that, we will sign off, and thank you for attending.